Ride in the Whirlwind was not just Monte Hellman's most undervalued Western. It was an existential art film disguised as a B-movie, made for $75,000 in a Utah canyon that no longer exists, submerged beneath an artificial lake before anyone thought to measure what had been lost there. Written by a 27-year-old actor who told his co-star not to act and accidentally taught him the method that would define his career. Sold to American television without a theatrical release by a producer who bundled it with exploitation pictures, and only understood it all by the French, who played it for 6 months in Paris while American audiences watched it between soap commercials and forgot everything they saw. We are digging into the wreckage of Ride in the Whirlwind, with 13 dark secrets the studio tried to bury, secrets locked inside Criterion supplements, Gary Kurtz's biographical record, Monte Hellman's documented conversations with his cast, and the specific ecological history of Glen Canyon before the water came in. The title, Ride in the Whirlwind, references a condition of total environmental disorientation, the rider caught inside a force of nature so complete and so directionless that forward motion becomes indistinguishable from circular movement. The Book of Job provides its closest scriptural resonance. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the whirlwind. In that context, the whirlwind is the voice of overwhelming power, addressing a man who has done nothing wrong. Wes and Vern are Job's cattle drovers transposed to Utah, men who have committed no crime, who are caught inside a system of accusation and pursuit so total that they can no longer move forward, only ride in the force that has enclosed them. The title does not promise resolution. It describes a condition. The men riding in the whirlwind at the film's beginning are still riding in it at the film's end, and the film closes without suggesting the whirlwind has stopped. This is not a Western title. It is a meteorological diagnosis of the human condition in the face of institutional power. The decision that produced Ride in the Whirlwind was made over a meal at the Brown Derby on Vine Street, south of Hollywood Boulevard, one of the small chain of famous Los Angeles restaurants that had been serving the industry since the 1920s. Monte Hellman had come to Roger Corman with a proposal for a single Western. By the end of lunch, Corman had agreed and had added a second film on the same budget and schedule, on the grounds that if Hellman was making one Western in Utah, he might as well make two. The logic was pure Corman economics. The fixed costs of getting the crew to Utah were already covered by the first film. The second would require only the marginal costs of keeping everyone there for a few more weeks. By the end of the lunch, Hellman had left with funding for two films neither he nor Nicholson had fully conceived, and a timeline that would require both screenplays to be written in parallel in a rented office in the Writers' Building on Little Santa Monica Boulevard in Beverly Hills, an office, Hellman noted with personal satisfaction, that was located directly next to Fred Astaire's. What Corman's lunch table economics produced, in the event, was two of the most formally radical American Westerns of the decade. Films that the existing B-movie distribution infrastructure could not accommodate, that no American theatrical distributor would take, and that had to be sold to television in a package of exploitation pictures that ensured they would be seen by the wrong audience, in the wrong format, at the wrong time. The same lunch that made the films also made their commercial failure inevitable. Corman's arithmetic and Hellman's ambition were never going to produce the same result. One made the calculation, the other made the art. Jack Nicholson's screenplay for Ride in the Whirlwind was built from a specific research method that most professional screenwriters would not have considered available. The letters and journals of frontier-era men and women who were not skilled writers. The dialogue that critics attacked as woodenly unrealistic in 1966, and that later critics have identified as the film's most precisely controlled formal achievement, was sourced from documents in which the speakers were struggling to articulate thoughts their vocabulary could not fully accommodate. Nicholson was not writing inarticulate characters because he was an inexperienced screenwriter. He was transcribing the verbal architecture of men for whom articulation was genuinely difficult, the gap between experience and language that constitutes the frontier's specific social condition. The line that the cagey film's critic identified as the film's most telling, "Man got hanged," Wes's entire observation upon discovering the outlaws executed on the trail is not bad dialogue. It is the precise verbal response of a man who has no framework for processing what he is looking at, expressed in the only words he has available. The critics who called the script thin were measuring it against a theatrical standard it had no interest in meeting. Before Ride in the Whirlwind can be discussed on its own terms, the shadow of its companion film must be acknowledged. The shooting, made simultaneously by the same director, with the same cinematographer, much of the same cast, and on an identical budget, consistently receives the superior critical assessment. The Criterion Collection's marketing prioritizes it. Academic discussions of existential westerns lead with it. The KG Films assessment calls it Hellman's masterpiece. What this consistent hierarchy obscures is that the two films are making different arguments with the same formal tools. The shooting operates in an abstract, allegorical mode, its narrative deliberately unresolvable, its characters deliberately unknowable. Ride in the Whirlwind operates in a mode of brutal social realism. Its characters are entirely knowable, its narrative is entirely clear, and its argument about institutional injustice is entirely legible. The comparison is not between a masterpiece and its lesser companion. It is between two genuinely different responses to the same formal challenge, of which the more legible one has been consistently undervalued because legibility has been mistaken for simplicity. Ride in the Whirlwind is not the lesser Hellman Western, it is the more political one. The financial parameters of Ride in the Whirlwind were set not by any creative assessment of what the film required, but by Roger Corman's arithmetic at the Brown Derby. Under $75,000 for each film, approximately $150,000 total for both, with the understanding that Hellman and Nicholson would personally cover any overages. This personal liability clause is the production's most consequential financial detail and the one most responsible for the film's formal character. Knowing they would personally pay for any budget excess, Hellman and Nicholson eliminated everything that was not strictly necessary for the film to exist. No extras, minimal dialogue, locations chosen for their accessibility rather than their visual grandeur. The vast, nearly empty Utah landscape that critics praised as an expression of existential philosophy was partly the result of two filmmakers who could not afford to fill it with people. The documentary, like simplicity, that made the film artistically distinctive was produced by the economic pressure of personal financial risk. Hellman later said that Corman would sometimes hire him for other productions, specifically to find out where he had shot the Utah films, and then fire him once they knew. The locations were his only capital. They are now underwater. The specific geography of Ride in the Whirlwind, the Red Canyon walls, the parched basin floors, the specific quality of light in Glen Canyon, and the Paria River area near Kanab, Utah, no longer exists as photographed. The completion of the Glen Canyon Dam in 1966, the same year the film premiered at the San Francisco International Film Festival, began the process of filling Glen Canyon with water. By 1980, Lake Powell had submerged approximately 250 square miles of canyonland, including the specific formations and valley floors that appear in both Ride in the Whirlwind and the shooting. Hellman, when he returned to the Utah locations for the Criterion Collection supplementary materials decades later, found that the places where he had filmed were beneath the surface of the lake. He was, as he documented, the last filmmaker to shoot in several of those specific locations before the water came. The reddish low mountains with white rock lines visible throughout the film are the last photographic record of a landscape that existed for geological epochs and was submerged in 14 years. The $75,000 Western that nobody saw in American theaters is the most complete visual archive of a geological formation that no longer exists. Among the supplementary materials in the Criterion Collection release of Ride in the Whirlwind and its companion film is Harry Stanton's account of an instruction Nicholson gave him during filming that Stanton said solidified his entire approach to acting. Stanton was preparing for a scene as Blind Dick, the outlaw leader, a role whose dramatic function required authority and menace without explicit action. Nicholson told him, in the terms that Stanton subsequently repeated in multiple interviews, to essentially do nothing, to let the wardrobe do the acting. Do not perform the character, wear the character, be present in the costume, and let the camera find what is there. This was not a casual piece of on-set advice. Stanton identified it as the formative instruction of his career, the directive that moved him from performing to inhabiting, from demonstration to presence. Stanton went on to build one of the most distinctive and deeply admired bodies of character work in American cinema. Cool Hand Luke, Alien, Repo Man, Paris, Texas, all of it traceable, in Stanton's own accounting, to a moment when a 27-year-old screenwriter, producer, actor in a Utah canyon told him to stop acting and let his coat do the work. The assistant director of Ride in the Whirlwind was Gary Kurtz. Then, a recent film school graduate, working his way through the Corman system, on the 40 or 50 exploitation films that constituted his early education in production. Kurtz managed the logistics of the Utah locations, the scheduling, the coordination of the limited crew across the 6-week back-to-back shoot in conditions that Hellman described as physically demanding and procedurally improvised. He subsequently became the associate producer of Two Lane Blacktop, another Hellman film, and then, through a connection to Francis Coppola, was introduced to a young director named George Lucas, whom he met while Lucas was editing THX 1138. Kurtz produced American Graffiti in 1973 and Star Wars in 1977. The assistant director who managed the $75,000 Utah Western that nobody saw in American theaters went on to produce the two most commercially significant films in the history of 20th Century Fox. The learning that happened in that Utah canyon, the specific discipline of making something from almost nothing, of solving production problems without institutional resources, was the foundation on which both American Graffiti's impossible $777,000 budget and Star Wars' chaotic British production were managed. Corman's economics built everything that followed. The specific mechanism by which Ride in the Whirlwind and the shooting were rendered invisible to American audiences is documented in Hellman's own account, with a precision that functions as a period document of how the independent film market operated in 1966. The two films were sold to a distributor, identified in various accounts as Walter Reed Jr., who then bundled them into a larger package of films sold to American television as a unit. Neither film was sold individually. Neither was assessed on its own merits as a potential theatrical release. They were commodities in a package transaction valued for their hours of content rather than their artistic achievement. The package was purchased by a television network. The films aired between commercials, without context, without critical preparation, without the festival platform that had given French audiences the vocabulary to receive them. The same films that played for 6 months in Paris to audiences who discussed them in the context of the Nouvelle Vague were shown in America between soap advertisements to audiences who had no framework for what they were watching and no reason to remember it afterward. It would take Jack Nicholson's Easy Rider breakthrough in 1969 for American distributors to reconsider what they had in their library, and by then the films had already been seen, in the worst possible conditions, by the wrong audience, in a format that stripped them of the silence and scale that made them work. The distribution mechanism was not incompetent. It was indifferent. The difference is the most depressing fact in the production's history. When Ride in the Whirlwind finally received theatrical distribution in France in 1969, 4 years after it was filmed, it ran for 6 months in Paris. Hellman documented this with a specificity that makes the comparison with the American experience precise. The shooting ran for a year in Paris. Ride in the Whirlwind ran for 6 months. The French critical apparatus that received both films had been shaped by André Bazin's theoretical framework for understanding what American cinema was doing beneath its genre surfaces. The idea that the Western, the gangster film, the thriller were forms that could carry serious philosophical and moral content precisely because their generic conventions had been internalized by both filmmakers and audiences. The French critics recognized in Hellman's films what they had been trained to recognize: the genre as a vehicle for something the genre's conventions were not adequate to express. The American critics, who dismissed Ride in the Whirlwind as flat and woodenly acted, had not been trained to look past the surface. The French critics had. Hellman acknowledged that being lionized in France in the late 1960s gave him a brief period of being very much in demand in Hollywood. The films that were dismissed in America were his calling card, and the French had written it. The critical vocabulary that has most consistently been applied to Ride in the Whirlwind and The Shooting since their Criterion release, existential, absurdist, Beckettian, identifies a lineage that Hellman never publicly claimed, and that the production circumstances would have made it impossible to advertise. Samuel Beckett's dramatic world, in which characters wait for things that do not arrive, pursue purposes that cannot be achieved, and speak with a halting literalism that exposes the gap between language and experience, is the theatrical ancestor of both films. Hellman's description of his approach to both screenplays, that he tended to cut out as much dialogue as he could, that he preferred to tell the story visually, that he avoided the obvious in terms of dialogue, is Beckett's aesthetic applied to the American Western. The Criterion Collection essay by Michael Atkinson describes the films as taking Beckett to the desert. That is the most precise critical description available, and it is the description that explains why the films work and why American audiences in 1966, who had no framework for Beckett applied to the Western, could not receive what they were watching. The critical reception of Ride in the Whirlwind in 1966, such as it was, given that the film received no American theatrical release and was reviewed primarily in trade papers covering its festival screenings, was dismissive with the specific confidence of reviewers who knew exactly what a Western should be. Variety's contemporaneous assessment called it flat and woodenly acted, with mild suspense that never grabs, and attributed the problem to Nicholson's script, which it described as a promising plotline rather than a fully developed scenario. The review applied to a formally radical existential Western, the criteria appropriate to a conventional genre thriller. Was the suspense sustained? Were the characters articulate? Was the plot fully developed? By those criteria, the film failed. By the criteria that the French critics were simultaneously developing, was the form interrogated? Was the genre's mythology exposed? Was the silence as expressive as the dialogue? The film succeeded comprehensively. The two critical frameworks were not measuring the same film. They were not even looking for the same things. Variety reviewed the Western it expected. It did not review the Western it watched. The 60 years since the film was sold into a television package have produced a critical reputation built almost entirely outside the institutional mechanisms that failed it in 1966. The Criterion Collection's 2014 release, 4K digital restoration supervised by Hellman himself, uncompressed monaural soundtrack, 2 hours of supplementary materials assembled from Hellman's own conversations with his cast and crew, gave the film its first adequate presentation to an American audience. The 93% Rotten Tomatoes rating that has accumulated since reflects a critical consensus that was always available to the film but never had a platform on which to express itself. The comparison to Jim Jarmusch and Michael Almereyda that the Dissolve critic made, identifying the laconic sensibility of 1980s and 1990s independent American cinema as traceable directly to Hellman's Utah Westerns, is the genealogical claim that matters most. That the independent American cinema that followed Easy Rider, that produced Jarmusch's Stranger Than Paradise and Almereyda's Nadja and a dozen other films in that tradition, was made possible by two films that nobody in America saw in theaters in 1966 and that the French understood immediately. The conversation that Hellman started in Utah was continued in Paris, returned to New York in the 1980s, and is now understood as one of the foundational gestures of American independent cinema. It just took 50 years to get the credit home. The film that survived made for $75,000 in a canyon that is now underwater by an actor-writer who sourced his dialogue from frontier illiteracy, shot by an assistant director who would go on to produce Star Wars, sold to television in a package of exploitation pictures, played for 6 months in Paris, and forgotten in America, restored in 4K by a director who returned to find his locations drowned, is the most precisely honest American Western of its decade and the most completely invisible. Hellman rode the whirlwind that Corman set in motion at the Brown Derby and emerged with two films that the distribution system could not accommodate and that France could. Nicholson wrote a screenplay from letters no one remembered and told Harry Stanton to let his coat do the acting. And Stanton carried that instruction through 4 decades of the most distinctive character work in American cinema. Gary Kurtz learned production discipline in a Utah canyon without resources and took it to American Graffiti and Star Wars. And the canyon itself, the specific reddish stone, the white rock lines, the quality of light in Glen Canyon before the dam, disappeared under Lake Powell while the film that documented it sat in a television vault waiting for someone to notice what had been submerged. But here is the question that Ride in the Whirlwind leaves embedded in that final shot. In Wes riding away from everything the whirlwind has taken from him toward an outcome the film refuses to specify. If the most formally rigorous American Western of 1966, the film that anticipated the entire aesthetic of independent American cinema for the following 30 years, that taught Harry Stanton how to act, that employed the future producer of Star Wars, and that was the last visual record of a geological formation now under a lake, was sold to television in a package of exploitation films because no American distributor could see what it was, then what does that tell you about how many films that defined decades were invisible to the institutions that owned them? And if the answer is most of them, which films sitting in streaming libraries right now are being watched between advertisements by audiences with no framework to receive them? And who will be the equivalent of the French 60 years from now, explaining what everyone missed? Leave that in the comments. If this investigation changed how you see Ride in the Whirlwind, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.